Well, today I'll be continuing the series that Chad and I started and have been doing now for about really half the duration of the series on showing mercy to the poor and needy and how our church can become more directly involved in such ministry. So no surprises here. This is just message number 9 in that series. Now, the last message in this series was one of Chad's, and it was about misguided mercy. That is, thinking of efforts to show mercy to the poor and needy that are actually not very well thought about and not exactly good in terms of helping them in the long run. And that message was meant to better shape your definition of poverty, first of all, so that you better understand the problem, so that you can work out a better solution, but also to encourage you to see yourself as the needy person, suffering from all the same fundamental problems that cause poverty in people that are of low income and very poor status. You have the same exact problems, just expressed differently. And then finally, the purpose of that message was to exhort you to set the best goals for meeting the needs of the poor. And all of that very much flows into this message. It's very closely connected. I've called this message, Effective Mercy Needs a Strategy. And I think you'll see how related it is to everything Chad was saying as I get moving with this. But that word, strategy, effective mercy needs a strategy. So I was going to ask the children here if they can tell me what the word strategy means. Anyone? Jonas?
Something hard.
Something hard. Well, it can be hard. Anyone else want to give a different definition? Anyone? Okay, so a strategy is a plan which you hope will accomplish some major goal. Usually it's something very difficult, which is probably where Jonas is getting the idea of hardship in there. So you've got to sit there and think about how you're going to do this and come up with a plan. That plan is your strategy for accomplishing your goal. Usually the word strategy gets used in matters of war. As you think about what you're going to do to destroy this other nation that for some reason your nation has decided to destroy, you need a strategy to go about that. And I like to use the word strategy here because we're talking about spiritual matters ultimately, and I think Chad made that very clear in his last message. The root of poverty, and all of it comes down to things that are very spiritual. And of course we know that when we enter into spiritual ideas and spiritual events and actions, we're talking about warfare. We're talking about souls, that have been successfully ensnared by Satan, and God has commanded us to actually be part of rescuing those souls. It is very much a military sort of thing. So in our warfare, we need a strategy of mercy to free the poor from their poverty. And that's very much part of Satan's plan. Satan uses all kinds of different strategies in his warfare to entrap souls. Poverty is a part of that. I mean, he very much uses the neediness of the needy person to wage war against their soul and destroy them. So when we come in with a strategy to match his strategy, it has to be a strategy of mercy. So this is very much a matter of warfare, and we're talking about strategy for that reason. Now my outline today for this sermon has 3 divisions. The first thing I want to do is survey what the Bible says about the causes of poverty. So we're going to talk about really 2 groups of things. Some causes of poverty that are very much beyond the control of the poor, and some things that are very much within their control and which are their fault. But one way or another, causes of poverty as portrayed by Scripture. For the second part of my sermon, I want to describe 3 general strategies for helping the poor, none of which originated with Chad or I. We got them from the book When Helping Hurts that we've been talking about all this series. But 3 strategies that we can use to help the poor. And then the third part of my outline is going to combine the first 2 points. I want to show that the causes of poverty must determine the strategy we use to help the needy. So all this talk about strategy is very much founded upon the causes of poverty and choosing a strategy accordingly, according to what causes of poverty we face in any given situation. Now, one of the most common reasons for the failure of efforts to help the poor is a failure to determine the best strategy for the situation at hand. Because you didn't think it through properly, and come up with the best plan to wage warfare against this person's poverty and ultimately against the devil, your efforts fail, ultimately. So regarding this idea of needing a good strategy to make these things work well, this is where I get the Ecclesiastes passage I mentioned, which I had you go there in case you're interested in seeing these. Very brief line here from Ecclesiastes 10, verse 10. One of these statements you get here, very Solomon-esque. He says, "If the axe is dull, and he does not sharpen its edge, then he must exert more strength. Wisdom has the advantage of giving success." Like, okay, so the wise person, when he realizes his axe isn't cutting anymore, the wise person is going to stop cutting and sharpen the axe so that he can actually do something to this tree. Meanwhile, the fool just keeps chopping at the tree and hopes it somehow starts cutting again. That's how the fool responds to that situation. We don't want to be a fool. We want to be wise people as we approach these things. Now, poverty is a tree that has dulled many axes over the centuries, over the millennia. It's practically always been among us. There have always been people trying to do things to help the poor, and much of that is by the plan of God, as we've talked about in earlier messages. But rather than doing any good, they just keep chopping away at poverty with a dull axe, never getting anywhere. We need to apply some thought to this. We need to find a way to sharpen the axe. We need to find a way to use our wisdom to give us success in our efforts to help the poor. So my goal in this sermon is very much to sharpen the axe, to use Solomon's terminology here. If we learn the best ways to help the poor, we might actually chop down the tree. We might actually find ways to enter into the lives of people in ways that are truly helpful for them and actually raise them up out of their poverty. So that is the hope of today's sermon. So to begin, I want to survey what the Bible says about the causes of poverty. What makes people poor? Any strategy for ending a problem must first identify the beginning of that problem. This is what we call dealing with the problem at its source. Or to keep using the tree analogy, you don't chop down a tree by chopping down all the branches in order. You go for the trunk. Well, in this case, if we want to fight poverty, you got to find the cause of poverty and attack poverty there. Otherwise, you're not going to get anywhere, or at least not in any good speed. So, what is the beginning of poverty according to the Bible? And here we're talking very much about material poverty. I know Chad's sermon last time addressed the 4 broken relationships that really undergird poverty and really all the problems of humanity. But now we're zeroing in more on material poverty and some explicit statements that the Bible makes about how people become poor. So I have broken these up into 2 categories, really. The first category of the causes of poverty are causes that are beyond the control of the poor. These are things that the poor person himself simply could not help. He couldn't do anything about this situation, even if he wanted to. This is the first category, causes which are beyond the control of the poor. And I have 4 causes of poverty within this category. First, sometimes people are poor because they lack a provider. That is to say, they lose the person who in their life was the person that actually provided them with, well, we would say money in our culture, because everything goes by money these days. But that is basically the problem, the lack of a provider. Now in Scripture, the chief example of this, as often is the case for the examples of poor people in general, is the orphan and the widow. You know, these are groups of people that are mentioned quite often in the Bible on matters of poverty. And here, just to give you one passage on this, James 1, verse 27, a verse I don't think we've read yet, but is worth reading at some point, so here we go. Pure and undefiled religion in the sight of God our Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself unstained by the world. So pure and undefiled religion, part of it is visiting orphans and widows in their distress. Well, why are they distressed? What's their problem? Well, if you're an orphan and a widow, it means the provider, the man in your family, has recently died and has left you without anyone to provide for your needs. In the ancient world, that was certainly a problem when there just weren't a lot of ways for women to make a living on their own. And of course, children being very dependent on their parents, and now they have one parent left. Very much a cause for concern and distress back in the ancient world, and even to some degree today that can be the case. So this distress here, this poverty of the orphan and the widow, however, is caused by the loss of a provider, which is something they couldn't help. I mean, they weren't trying to lose their provider. It wasn't part of the plan, it just happened. So that's one cause of poverty beyond their control. Another cause of poverty like this is what may be called a natural disaster. The second cause of poverty. And for this one, I do have a biblical example that I think is also worthy of mention. Acts chapter 11. And again, we're turning to a lot of scriptures, especially in this first part of the message, so you may not want to bother turning here. You might just want to write them down or ask me for my references later. Acts 11, verse 28, one of these kind of random events in the early church. Now at this time, some prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. One of them, named Agabus, stood up and began to indicate by the Spirit there would certainly be a great famine all over the world. So a famine occurs whenever there's a shortage of food. Okay? And this took place in the reign of Claudius. And in the proportion that any of the disciples had means, each of them determined to send a contribution for the relief of the brethren living in Judea. And this they did, sending it in the charge of Barnabas and Saul to the elders. So here the cause of the poverty that's going to result there in Jerusalem and Judea is a famine. All right? And there's nothing you can, a famine just hits. What are you going to do about it? It just happens. But famines are not the only natural disasters that can cause poverty. In our part of the world, it's more likely to be things like earthquakes, tsunamis, floods, and tornadoes, depending on what part of the country you're in. Here in the middle of the Midwest, it's not usually things like tsunamis. They're pretty far away. But there are natural disasters, and they can have a great effect on a person's life and can cause poverty. If this natural disaster comes in and takes away all your stuff, you are now poor. And it had nothing to do with anything you did, just totally beyond you. All right, third cause of poverty, also beyond the control of the poor, is poor health. Sometimes poor health can make you materially poor. Another example from the book of Acts, as I was thinking about this, Acts chapter 3, verses 1 through 2. You see an example of a man very much in this state. Acts 3, verse 1 says, Now Peter and John were going up to the temple at the 9th hour, the hour of prayer. And a man who had been lame from his mother's womb was being carried along, whom they used to set down every day at the gate of the temple, which is called Beautiful, in order to beg alms of those who were entering the temple. So here's a man lame in his feet from birth. And the question is, what else is a lame man going to do to make money? Especially in that time and place where most of the jobs are manual and he can't even walk. What's he going to do except beg? He's going to be a poor man dependent on the goodness of others. By nature of just his state, his poor health has caused him to be poor. And there's a final fourth cause of poverty, which is beyond the control of the poor, and that is injustice, or we might say oppression. I tend to use the terms interchangeably in this series. I guess you could talk about differences between them, but injustice or oppression. This is a very common one, and we've already talked about this some in earlier messages, but to give you another passage, Proverbs 13, verse 23 has a statement about this. It says, so abundant food is in the fallow ground of the poor, but it is swept away by injustice. Here's a man, he has a pretty good field that he could farm and make crops and all that kind of thing, but someone bigger and less righteous than he just comes and takes it. That's oppression, that's injustice. It is swept away by injustice, and that's why this guy's poor. He has the means to help himself, he just can't get through all that oppression that's there. So those are four causes of poverty that all belong to this first category, causes that are beyond the control of the poor. Loss of a provider, natural disaster, poor health, or injustice. Those are things beyond the control of the poor that actually cause poverty. However, there are other causes of poverty mentioned in Scripture. There are 4 others, so we're going to have a grand total of 8 causes by the time we're done here. And these next four causes of poverty are actually instances in which the poor person could help himself and get out of his poverty, but the fault is his own in these cases for why he is poor. So the first of these is the one that probably occurs most naturally to us, is a negligence in working. We might just use the term laziness, but negligence in working. This is another one for the book of Proverbs. In fact, the rest of these are from the book of Proverbs, so you could feasibly stay there and turn a few pages and find these if you wanted to. Proverbs 10, verse 4 says, "Poor is he who works with a negligent hand, but the hand of the diligent makes rich." Okay, so what's the difference, according to this proverb, between a poor man and a rich man? Well, the poor man is negligent in his work, but the rich man is diligent in his work. So here's something that, hey, you want to know why this guy's poor? He's just lazy. That's his problem. So that's one cause of poverty that is very much within the control of the poor people themselves. The second cause of poverty in this category is the fault of self-indulgence. Okay, so self-indulgence. So to indulge yourself, to use the term this way, means you basically give yourself all these things that you want that aren't exactly good for you, but you want them, so you're going to give them to yourself anyway. The book of Proverbs mentions this as well as a cause of poverty. This is chapter 21, verse 17. There are quite a few verses on this, but I just have one for you. It says, "He who loves pleasure will become a poor man. He who loves wine and oil will not become rich." All right, so here's a guy, he's poor. Why is he poor? Because he loves pleasure. He loves stuff, wine and oil. And this, of course, is oil, not petroleum that you put in your car, but like, olive oil, stuff like that. These kinds of things, they cost money. And if you're going to spend a lot of money on these things, you're not going to have a lot of money left over, and therefore you're going to be poor. The modern equivalents of these kinds of things, you might say beer, cigarettes, and big screen TVs. Those kinds of things, if you love those kinds of things and you just spend your money on them all the time, yeah, you're going to be poor. You're not going to have a lot of money left over. That's the result of loving pleasure. That's self-indulgence and how it causes poverty. That's the second cause of poverty within the control of poor people themselves. My third cause of poverty here in this category is hastiness, which is something you may not think of immediately when you think of why you become poor, but hastiness is mentioned in the Bible. Proverbs 21, verse 5 says, "The plans of the diligent lead surely to advantage, but everyone who is hasty comes surely to poverty." So just as certainly as your diligence is going to cause wealth and prosperity, in that way, your hastiness is going to cause you poverty. It's a sure thing. And I suppose this hastiness he has in mind could take a few different forms. It could be the kind of hastiness that makes you act before you think. You do something before you think it through properly. In this case, you probably become poor because of really dumb choices. You just sort of react to your situations and make really expensive mistakes, and therefore you're poor. It could also be the kind of hastiness that makes you rush through a job without doing it well. Maybe you have a job, and it might be a pretty good job, but you just don't dedicate the time to really working the problems that come your way in your job, and you do a really bad job. Your boss doesn't like you. He's not willing to give you raises. Maybe he just fires you. That kind of hastiness could also lead to poverty. So it could take a few different forms, but hastiness is very much a cause of poverty, and it's a cause that is the fault of the poor man himself if he is in fact hasty. I mean, that's something he's doing. So that's a third cause of poverty within the control of the poor themselves. And then I have one more example of this kind of cause of poverty, and that is disregarding discipline and reproof. Okay, so disregarding discipline and reproof. Lots of stuff in the Proverbs about discipline and reproof and how important they are, and some of this gets tied into poverty as well. Proverbs 13, verse 18 gives us one of these statements. He says, "Poverty and shame will come to him who neglects discipline, but he who regards reproof will be honored." So this proverb approaches the matter from two different directions. First of all, the reproof. Okay, this is when someone comes to you and corrects you. He says, look, what you're doing isn't right. Stop doing that. Okay, that's reproof. Usually has kind of an edge to it. No one likes being reproved. But this is reproof, okay? And a great many people would have made much better choices in life had they listened to someone who reproved them. There are people that come to you and say, look, what you're doing here isn't smart. Don't do that. And you say, I'll do it anyway. And guess what? It's not going to go well for you. And some of those mistakes you're going to make are going to be expensive mistakes, or they're going to prevent you from getting ahead in terms of material things. So disregarding reproof is a very bad choice on your part, and it's going to lead to poverty. Now, as for the discipline, that could be taken a couple different ways. It could be self-discipline, a person's ability to make himself do things that he doesn't necessarily want to do, but he knows he should do them. Self-discipline. If you're disregarding self-discipline, that would be basically a form of negligence in a lot of ways, and therefore we've already covered that. But could also be neglecting the efforts of other people to train you, like maybe your parents. If you're a child that doesn't listen to your parents and doesn't learn the things they're trying to teach you when they're disciplining you, you might grow up to be a poor person because you didn't learn the things that you needed to know to be a competent adult, able to work a job and make your way in the world. You disregard discipline in that way, yeah, you're going to be poor and it's going to be your fault. So altogether, we have 8 causes of poverty we see in the Bible, and I'm pretty sure, Chad and I tried hard to make sure that list was exhaustive for the causes of poverty as related in Scripture. So there's at least covers most of the ground out there. These 8 causes of poverty falling into 2 different categories. Sometimes people are poor for reasons beyond their control, like losing a provider or a natural disaster or poor health or injustice. But other times people are poor because of their own faulty character, like negligence in work, self-indulgence, hastiness, or a disregard for discipline and reproof. Those are the biblical causes of poverty that we have to bear in mind as we discuss a strategy for helping the poor. We're going to come back to those causes later on in this sermon toward the end and readdress them from the perspective of building a strategy. So we've got to keep those things in mind. Again, it's part of chopping down the tree at its root. And now I'm going to do my second part of this message, and that is describing 3 general strategies for helping the poor. So 3 things you might do. Now, before I talk about the 3 strategies, I want to remind you of the one goal. And this is going back to things Chad was saying last time when he talked about the 4 broken relationships that people have and how they cause poverty. Remember that our goal is not simply to increase somebody's standard of living. We're not talking about getting them more of a paycheck. We're not talking about getting them a nicer house. Those things are good, but that's ultimately not where we're going with all this. That's not our goal. Here's the goal. With each of these strategies, all 3 of the strategies that I'm about to talk about, the one goal is to move all people involved, both the poor people and we who are helping them. The goal is to move all people involved closer to being in a right relationship with God, with themselves, with other people, and with the whole of creation. Okay? Those are the 4 big relationships that Chad was talking about last time, and all of those need some repair work, living in the world after the fall, and we need that ourselves. The poor people need it as well, and that's our one goal. With all these strategies, we're trying to move people, including ourselves, in that direction. So as I talk about these 3 strategies, don't forget that one goal. These are all tied together. Now, the 3 strategies themselves. Later in this sermon, I'll connect these all to the causes of poverty that I was just talking about, but for now, I just want to lay out what these 3 strategies are, talk about them well enough to get you an idea of what they are. All of these are from the book When Helping Hurts by Corbett and Fickert, and I don't know if they actually created these categories or if they just gave words to them, but these are their categories for thinking about these strategies, and so Chad and I find them helpful. We're going to use them. So the 3 strategies are called by these words: relief, rehabilitation, and development. So those are the 3 strategies for this sermon: relief, rehabilitation, and development. I'm going to start with relief. Now, relief, to give you their definition, is the temporary provision of emergency aid to reduce immediate suffering from a natural or man-made crisis. Okay, relief is the temporary provision of emergency aid to reduce immediate suffering from a natural or man-made crisis. Now, I want to begin by focusing on that last word, crisis. A lot of the ways that these guys think about poverty has to do with the role of a crisis in their life, and whether there is a crisis, how far in the past it is, a crisis. So a crisis, something bad that has recently happened in this person's life that has taken them from surviving down to might not survive. Like, it's that bad. Something has happened to where whether they're actually going to make it in life, whether they're actually going to survive, it's kind of up in the air now. That's a crisis. Now, that crisis could be natural or it could be man-made. Could be something that happens in the weather or in the world. Could be something they brought upon themselves, something other people did to them, natural or man-made. It could be the person's own fault, could be none of their fault, but one way or another, it is a crisis. And whatever happened, this person is suffering after that recent crisis. They can point to specific problems they have which arose from this crisis that is causing them suffering. Now, when you act to reduce that suffering in a person's life, you are practicing the strategy of relief. When you hear about their suffering and you come in with some kind of immediate help, that is what the book When Helping Hurts calls relief. Okay? Now, there's another word in that definition I gave earlier for what relief is. And I'm going to ask you to remember this for later, and that is the word temporary. It is a word that's very important for them as they discuss the strategy of relief. So temporary, just remember that word. We're going to come back to it, but that word is in the definition. Relief is the temporary provision of emergency aid to reduce immediate suffering from a natural or a man-made crisis. That is the first strategy that you could use in addressing somebody's poverty, the strategy of relief. So, the second strategy in this list, the strategy of rehabilitation. I'm again going to give you their definition for this. Rehabilitation is the effort to restore people and communities to the good aspects of their pre-crisis conditions. Rehabilitation is the effort to restore people and communities to the good aspects of their pre-crisis conditions. So rehabilitation begins when you consider the way this person's life was before the crisis. When you stop and you ask yourself, I wonder what this person's life was like when they were actually surviving on their own. When they didn't need me to come in here with this immediate relief. What was their life actually like when they were making it? So the aim of that examination, when you ask that question, is to discover what was good about their lives at that time. What good things were they already doing, allowing them to support themselves and make their way in the world. And once you discover those good aspects, you help that person by trying to restore those good aspects. You try to get them to the point where they are once again exercising all the good actions and all the good activities they had before that crisis struck. And finally, don't miss this detail, rehabilitation is often practiced toward whole communities. Okay, we've been talking about the poor person as though he were an individual. It's possible to do this. It's also possible to do relief to a whole community, to go into a whole zone of the world that has been afflicted by some crisis and provide relief. But then you can go on and do rehabilitation as well. So just to throw that in there, we're not just talking about the individual poor man, we might be talking about a whole community as well. Bear that in mind. Rehabilitation. Okay, so that's the second strategy. Rehabilitation is the effort to restore people and communities to the good aspects of their pre-crisis conditions. You might think of it as hitting rewind and taking them back to exactly where they were before the crisis hit. That's rehabilitation. Rehabilitation is rewinding. Okay, if you want to put it that way. One more strategy that they talk about in their book, and that is the strategy of development. Now, development is the effort to move people and communities to the good conditions beyond their pre-crisis conditions. All right, so this is, in a sense, I guess you could say it looks very similar to rehabilitation, but it really takes everything a step further. Whereas with rehabilitation, you try to get people back to where they were. In development, you're trying to take them beyond where they ever were, getting them into a better situation than they have ever had. So you start development work when you sit there and you ask yourself, how can I make these people's lives better than they were even before this crisis hit? How can I take them further than they've ever gone? That is the question that begins the process of development. This is the strategy of development. So again, development is the effort to move people and communities to good conditions beyond their pre-crisis conditions. So, just to give you those three strategies again very briefly, relief saves the person from the crisis, rehabilitation reverses the crisis, and development takes that person even further than the rehabilitation did. Okay, so relief, rehabilitation, and development. Now, consider these strategies in the context of perhaps someone losing their home. Let's just give this as an example. Someone has, for whatever reason, they have lost their house. They no longer have a place to live. They are homeless. So if someone loses his home, you practice relief by getting that person a place to stay temporarily. Maybe you invite the person into your own home. Maybe in a situation where a whole community has been wiped out, you go in there with the tent shelters and all that sort of thing. That is relief. You immediately and temporarily get this person a new place to stay. And then you practice rehabilitation by getting them into a new home of their own. Okay, so maybe they're crashing at your house. That's a very temporary solution. Now you begin the process of finding them someplace they can live, that they can afford, or getting help to get them to buy that place. Just getting them into a place of their own, or a place they can rent, whatever. Getting them into their own place once again. Because before this crisis struck, they had a place of their own, and you're getting them back to that state of affairs. That's rehabilitation. And then from there, you can practice development by teaching that person perhaps to avoid and prevent the situation that made them homeless in the first place. Maybe somehow, maybe they did something wrong with their house. Maybe they, I can think of a whole kind of situations that could happen there. Maybe something simple like maybe they just didn't have insurance, okay? They couldn't afford to get in a house of their own after their house caved in or whatever. I mean, just any number of things there to get their situation better than it was before. That would be development. Now, you can do this also, of course, with communities. I talked about with the people, a whole community being wiped out, you get them in tent shelters. Then maybe the rehabilitation effort goes in there, gets new houses in place, and then after that, you teach them more about survivability, how to prevent whatever disaster came in and wiped out their homes. If they're living in a war zone, maybe that's finding a way to bring greater peace to the area. If it's a place of natural disasters, maybe that means before you rebuild all their houses, you move them to a different place. That'd be a form of development, I think. These kinds of things. There's a lot of fluidity here. There's any number of ways you can provide this kind of relief, rehabilitation, development. And sometimes they blur together. But the three basic categories as strategies are very helpful. As you think about a specific situation, whether with a person or a community, these kinds of thought divisions help. And those are the three strategies I have in mind. Now, in this last part of the sermon, what I want to do is I want to combine what I said about the causes of poverty with these strategies. We're going to bring them together here. And as I'm sure you've already guessed, the exact strategy you use is going to depend sometimes on the exact cause of poverty that was there. So you're going to assess the cause of this person's poverty, and from there, you're going to choose the strategy. So what I want to do is I want to move through the three strategies again: relief, rehabilitation, development, and talk about the causes of poverty that might come into play and when that strategy fits dealing with that cause. So let's start with relief. Relief, once again, is the temporary provision of emergency aid to reduce immediate suffering from a natural or man-made crisis. Which means ultimately relief it takes the form of giving people free stuff. Okay, that's basically what it comes down to. You're coming into their life, you come in with the relief trucks or whatever, and you start unpacking supplies of some sort. Food, clothing, whatever. You give people free stuff. Now in the book, When Helping Hurts, the authors advise that this relief, giving people free stuff, should be seldom, immediate, and temporary. These are three words that they stress pretty heavily: seldom, immediate, and temporary. As for why it should be immediate, that's pretty obvious, because the crisis is real and devastating. It's still having very much an effect on these people. Any delay would make your relief worthless. If people are currently without food, you have to get them food now. If they're without drinkable water, that's even more important. You've got to get them that water now. I mean, if it's wintertime and they don't have coats or anything, they're going to freeze to death unless you get them relief now. So relief needs to be very immediate. That's the way it has to work. However, you might not see their point about making relief seldom and temporary. If you've not thought about these things very carefully, you might think it's motivated by stinginess. It's like, well, I'll give you this gift now, but I don't want to do this for the long term because I'm miserly. Like, you might think of it that way, but that's not really the point here. I want you to consider the causes of poverty, and those will indicate why relief should be temporary and seldom. Now, some of those causes of poverty that I talked about were very much character faults. These are things within the poor person himself that make them poor, namely negligence, self-indulgence, and a lack of discipline, are the things I have in mind at this point. Now, here's the thing. People with those character traits, they tend to get worse if you give them free stuff. I mean, seriously, if that is your way of dealing with these kinds of people, people who are on the lazy side, people that just spend all the money they get on pleasures, or people that just don't have any discipline, you give them free stuff, they waste it very often. Unless there really is that kind of critical need right now where they have to spend this money on things they actually need. I mean, they might actually do that in that case if they actually have a need, but if there's any leeway at all, they're probably going to use the money you give them or the relief you give them very badly, just because they don't have the character traits of a person that is wise with those kinds of resources. They don't have it in them. They're not that kind of person. They just won't get it right. Therefore, if the needy people you meet are characterized by those kinds of faults, you do not want your main strategy to be relief. You don't want to base everything off of just giving these people free stuff over and over again. The free stuff you give them is only going to make them worse. Which raises the question, okay? If you don't want to help those people in this way, when should you use relief? When is relief a good idea? When is it a good idea to give people free stuff? Well, in this case, I would say when that crisis is really due to something beyond their control. If someone has lost a provider, or if there's been a natural disaster, or if there's been some bodily trauma, or some kind of injustice, I think those are the cases when relief is a very effective strategy. There's two common factors at work there. First, none of those causes of poverty are the fault of the poor person. These are things that they had no control over. They might be fine, upstanding people, perfectly capable of making their way in the world on their own, and then a tornado struck, and they couldn't help that. Or somebody died, they couldn't help that. They got a horrible disease that the doctors can't fix. They couldn't help that. They couldn't help these things. Therefore, you come in with relief. Secondly, and more importantly, these kinds of things are going to be very seldom. It's not every day that a tsunami levels your village. It's not every day that your provider dies. These things are not common in the lifespan of a specific person. So all of that comes together to answer the reason that relief should be seldom and temporary. Okay? It's seldom because these kinds of things don't happen, often, but it's temporary because the crisis that caused this is not going to last forever, and if you keep giving people free stuff afterward, they're never going to get out on their own and rebuild in the way they ought to. So all that stuff together, the whole reason that relief is seldom, immediate, and temporary, it has to do with the causes of poverty involved. When you're dealing with a relief strategy, it's usually because of some cause that's not the fault of the poor person. So all of this works together. The causes of the poverty and the strategy you use, they're united, okay? And this is how I would like you to think about it. The causes of the poverty are not due to faults within the person. and it's something that happened just recently, a recent crisis, all of that combines to give you the strategy of relief. That's the strategy you want to use when those causes are at work. Okay, so the second strategy is rehabilitation. We need to consider when that should be our main strategy. Rehabilitation is the effort to restore people and communities to the good aspects of their pre-crisis condition. This is trying to hit rewind to their life and getting them to where they were before. Now, the trick with this is you have to restore them to the good aspects of their pre-crisis condition without causing brand new problems. You have to take them back to where they were without adding new kinds of problems in there that they didn't have before. In all the help you're going to be giving to the poor after their crisis, you run the risk of making them dependent. Okay? It comes to the point where if they get accustomed to getting free stuff from you during the relief period, they might come to bank on that and never actually getting to the point where they were before, where they were surviving more on their own. Now, on the one hand, that could scare you to the point where you don't want to help people. I mean, you might say, well, if I'm going to turn them into a dependent, I don't want to do that, so I'm just not going to help at all. But really, the right way of doing it is just to go in there with a little more wisdom. You have to go in here to the situation, honestly asking yourself, how do I get them back to where they were without making them dependent on me? And really, we have an age-old saying on this. I have no idea who first said this, but it's been said billions of times, perhaps, in the history of the world, in one language or another, in one place or another. The whole saying about catching a man a fish, you feed him for a day, teach a man to fish, you feed him for life. That's the basic idea of a rehabilitation strategy. The relief strategy, yeah, you got to give them stuff at first because they don't have anything. They've lost stuff. You got to just give them stuff then. But when you go to rehabilitation, you have to teach them once again to get their own stuff, which hopefully they were doing before, but now you've got to get them to the point where they're doing that again. Got to kind of wean them off receiving and got to get them to the point where they're creating, where they're doing their own thing. So, when do we employ this rehabilitation strategy? Well, first of all, when the physical need is no longer urgent, that's a good key thing here. When the crisis has started to fade more into the back of the mind, the people aren't thinking all the time about this crisis that just happened, that's a good indication that it's time to go on to rehabilitation. That's one thing. But also, you got to get this person to the point where they are the kind of person that can do this, the kind of person that can catch the fish. They have to be diligent, they have to be restrained and thoughtful and disciplined so that he can start to work on his own again and sustain his own life. So if you look at this person and they are already there, you can start actually kind of getting them moving forward on their own, or you may have to start teaching them those things, start at the very basic aspects of their character, teaching them to be diligent, teaching them to be restrained, thoughtful, and disciplined. Those kinds of things come into rehabilitation. All right, so the crisis is largely over. Giving them free stuff is going to be more of a liability now because it could teach them some bad habits. It's time now to teach them good habits, teach them good character traits, how to catch the fish on their own. Okay, that's rehabilitation, and it's very much linked to causes of poverty. I think in this case, if these people are just starting to learn dependency, it's time to teach them how to not be dependent and get them into a rehabilitation stage. Now, development is very related to rehabilitation. It's like continuing what you've already started, but there are some very specific things to say about development and when it's warranted and what causes of poverty are linked to it. Basically, it seems to me that development should be used in two instances, okay? Two big instances here. The first instance, development should be used when the crisis is in the far distant past, but the person or the people are still not thriving. And when I say the far distant past, I mean the person no longer thinks about the crisis every day, or maybe it was the crisis of a past generation. This happened decades ago, and yet somehow the people involved are still living the way they were just after the crisis. I mean, they just have never recuperated from this crisis that happened. And so by the time the crisis has receded into the far distant past, the needy people should be thriving on their own. I mean, think about, I don't know why I thought about this, but the pilgrims coming over to America and all that, you have those few rough winters where they're all dying off, but eventually they learn how to thrive over here and they start doing well on their own, okay? Well, sometimes people just remain poor, where every time the winter comes, people die and they never have enough food. Sometimes, this is especially a regional problem, sometimes they just never develop. They just never get out of that phase. And a lot of times, it's because of the faulty character traits. They've never learned how to do what needs to be done and become the kind of people they need to be to get past that state. In which case, development becomes necessary. You got to take these people beyond where they've ever been. They have not within living memory been in a state that has been good. They've never been surviving on their own. They don't even know what that's like. You have to take them far beyond that to something they've never been before. And that's development. And usually it means, teaching them how to do things and teaching them how to be the kinds of people that can thrive on their own. For the most part, this is not a problem of their provider just died or they just recently got sick. This is usually a problem in a whole culture where they have not learned as a culture to be the kind of people that can survive on their own. And even though we think about this in terms of region, within a culture you can have a part of society that is having this problem. We have, I think, a whole strata of our society where people just have never learned to improve their own situation. And that's kind of what I have in mind here for dealing with things here at home in America. You have a whole strata of our society where they've just, their grandfather never, these people learn from their parents, and then those parents learn from their parents, and just this systemic problem that they've had in this generational type of thing. That needs development. You got to take them beyond where they or their family has ever been. Okay, that's one instance where you use development. The other instance is oppression or injustice. So not to pin everything on the poor people themselves, there are just times where whole communities or even individual people are just under the thumb of the rich and powerful. Somewhere, somehow, some person got into a state where he had more money and more influence, and he uses that to keep people down. He uses that to live off the backs of other people. Now, in that situation, relief really isn't the answer, because whatever you give to the poor is going to be stolen by the rich. No use bringing in a relief truck when it's going to be all taken by warlords or whatever, right? Okay, rehabilitation also will not work because, in a sense, their crisis is not yet over. You have this weird state where the crisis is this ongoing thing, and the crisis is oppression or injustice. So really, relief and rehabilitation doesn't really work. You have to use development. You have to take these people far beyond where they ever were. You have to take them out of the oppression, out of the injustice, which usually means, more accurately, attacking the oppressors, attacking the source of the injustice, finding who is responsible in this person's life or in this community's life. Who is the person? Who is the body of people? What is the institution at fault for this? Who is keeping these people in a state of poverty? And then you go after them, right? You find some way to shake their power or to bring people out from underneath their power. Job uses the colorful illustration of breaking the teeth of the wicked. I think very often you should not actually find the person and break his teeth in. Hopefully it will never come to that. But there is very much a cause for finding out the people in a society or in a person's individual life who is very much responsible for keeping them in poverty and doing something about that. That is a form of development, a very specific form of development, because you're taking this person far beyond where they've ever been, probably. So, there are two instances there where development is the thing you want to do. One situation is the injustice. The other is just a long-standing pattern in this society or this culture or this strata of society where they've just never gotten over some past crisis and they have just always been in this poor state. Those two instances, that's when you bring in development. And again, it's related to the cause of their poverty. whether it's some long-standing problem in their culture or just the oppression or the injustice at work in their lives from other people. So all of that, that's how the causes of poverty affect the strategy you choose and what strategies you might choose. I hope all of that has some effect of helping you learn how to chop down the tree, to begin with our analogy that we had there at the beginning. The effective strategy. How do we chop down this tree? Well, it depends on what you're facing. So you have these causes of poverty, just to review these things. Some causes of poverty very much beyond the control of a person. Some causes of poverty that are very much the fault of the person who is poor. It could be one or the other. You got to find the exact cause or causes. And then you got to take that and you got to think about the strategies you could use. There's relief, there's rehabilitation, then there's development. You know, relief is coming in there with the immediate aid against a crisis that's right there. Rehabilitation involves getting that person back to where they were before the crisis. And then development is taking them beyond where they've ever been, you know, better than they've ever been. And then finally, just comparing those two and thinking about the cause and choosing the strategy that fits the cause. You know, I've crammed all of this into an hour sermon, and to me it feels very rushed and maybe over-condensed. That's because really every situation is very different, and it requires strategy. You got to sit there and think strategically about this person or this community. Really understand the cause of their poverty. I mean, we had these pigeonholes here, you know, these 8 causes of poverty as outlined by the Bible. But, I mean, you got to sit there and think, okay, is there more than one at work? Maybe at first it seems like his problem is this, but then it's actually this underneath that. That takes thought. You got to sit there and dedicate some time to this, and then you got to ask yourself where on the spectrum he is. You know, does he need relief, rehabilitation, development? It might take some time to figure that out. And sometimes the line is pretty hazy. You know, these aren't perfectly distinct categories we're giving you here, but they are helpful to think about as you think about the cause and the strategy to be used. So again, it's very condensed, but these are the basic guidelines that we think are very helpful for assessing a person's poverty and how to help them most effectively with the right strategy. Now, some of this deserves further comment, and that's where I'm going to be going next time on Wednesday with my, with my next sermon, which is going to be called Mercy Through Partnership. This has to do a little bit more with rehabilitation and development, because relief is a pretty simple concept, just give people the stuff they need. But rehabilitation and development, it's like, okay, how do you really enter into this person's life and teach them how to be a self-sustaining person without creating dependence and getting them out on their own? How do you do it? What does that look like? Well, it requires more attention. My next sermon is really going to focus on rehabilitation and development, specifically with a focus on learning how to work with the poor, how to partner with them in their own development. So that's a huge chunk of how rehabilitation and development works. You get them involved in their own betterment, and you're just sort of in charge of helping them learn that. So that's the theme for next time. It's really going to continue stuff I've talked about today, but with a bit more of a focus on this partnership and how to partner with the poor in their own rehabilitation and their own development. So that's where I'm going next time. But that doesn't mean you can't ask questions now about these things, and I welcome that. Are there any questions or comments? Or for those of you who have read the book, anything I missed that might be really important? I know some of you have read the book on this. Anything on this sort of thing?